All right. Hello, hello, Brittany. How are you?
I'm so good. How are you?
I am doing well. So, for anyone watching this video, it wasn't normally going to be a video posted after the fact. Listen, we live and we learn. They don't teach you how to use technology in graduate school for mental health. You know
No,
what?
no, lots of things, not that.
Yeah, you know what? Diagnostics, got it. Learning how to go live on Instagram,
No.
missed that day in class. So thank you to everyone who is flexible with our, in by our, I mean my gaps in understanding of technology. Look, we listen, we learn, we make it work. But I'm just so happy to have you today, Brittany, to talk all things OCD for OCD Awareness Month.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited. OCD is my passion. It is my life. I have lived it. I have learned it. And so I'm really excited to tell you about my journey with OCD and then the work that I'm doing with it now.
I love that. So, just for the people that have not seen your face or they don't know you, can you do a little bit of an introduction about your lovely self?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Brittany Parow. I am a lead school psychologist in Fulton County Schools. I work right now in the school setting. We do evaluation for students with disabilities, we do intervention work. So that's my career. I'm also a person with diagnosed OCD. We will talk about that journey. I was diagnosed at 25, but I had childhood onset. My symptoms started at age 7. And so, as I've come to terms with that diagnosis, I have become really passionate about OCD education and awareness. And so, I have become an expert in OCD. I have guest lectured at Georgia State on OCD, so their graduate level classes. I've done trainings for educational professionals, for mental health professionals. It's a really cool intersection where you can weave in what the literature says, what the research says, and then also what did this look like as a 7-year-old child? What did this look like as a 25-year-old? What does this look like now as someone who has it managed? And so it's an amazing opportunity to advocate for my community, but also when I have parents come into the schools with children with OCD, to show them that I am a person living with this who has succeeded with this is just a really unique opportunity.
That is absolutely incredible. And that just makes me so grateful that like you're giving us your time today,
Oh my gosh,
knowing
oh, I'm so
like
excited.
how incredibly knowledgeable you are at a personal and professional stance. That is huge. And also congratulations on that body of work too. That is absolutely remarkable.
So much. Yeah, thank you.
So, can you tell me more about just like your connections to OCD? And I imagine you haven't been as open about it as you are today. Like, how did your kind of knowledge of OCD come to what it is now?
It's really an interesting story. So please interrupt me as I go. I'm going to start with when I got my diagnosis, and then I'm going to backtrack.
Hmm.
So I was diagnosed with OCD at 25. At that point, I had a master's and specialist degree in mental health and school psychology. And yet, at that point, when they told me I had an OCD diagnosis and therapy, I said, absolutely not. You were incorrect. I know what OCD is. I know what that looks like. That's not what I have. You are very wrong. Uh,
That's like the
and
opposite of what happens. I feel like in the psychodiagnostics class, everyone's like, "Oh, I have this, I have that." Meanwhile,
yeah,
you're like, "Nope, that's not me."
I think that's the issue with OCD. It's so heavily stigmatized in what we see in media and what we see even in research is that we see one small group. We typically see contamination OCD. And so the OCD that I was dealing with was scrupulosity OCD, was harm OCD. We can talk more about that as we go, but you don't see that portrayed. So when I heard OCD, I thought, okay, well, what are my compulsions? I'm not having compulsions, and compulsions can be mental. I wasn't educated on that. And so when my first therapist and she and I were not a good fit. And so I think about 30 seconds into my first ever therapy session, she was like, so you have OCD. And it wasn't the right time. It wasn't a good fit. Uh, and I was like, no, no, no. And I have a significant trauma history. So I was trying to unwind that as well. And what is trauma and what is mental health? And so I shifted to a new therapist, Dr. Angela Lee. I will forever say her name. She changed my life. She's incredible. And she let me get there on my own terms. And so as we started processing trauma in therapy and processing my life, I started looking up symptoms of OCD and I was like, oh no. I have done every single one of these over the course of my life. In fact, the therapist I had after Angela was like, you are a textbook course on OCD. You have had every kind of OCD over the course of your lifespan. And so I went to Angela one day and I said, "Hey, Angela, I think I have OCD." And she picks up this piece of paper and she flips it over and it says, "Discuss OCD diagnosis." And she was like, "Correct." It's like, okay. And then I think from there, because I had childhood onset, and I'll talk about what that looked like as a kid,
Mhm.
it was this really unique position to reframe my entire life because I've been dealing with OCD my whole life and it's been impacting my relationships and my life. And being able to look back on my life and offer myself grace for all those times where I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I was in
Mhm.
distress, was really beautiful, but also earth shattering. You're reframing your entire existence. You're trying to figure out, who am I? What is my OCD? Uh, and so I think when I first got the diagnosis, the issue I had with diagnosis disclosure, and one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about it, is that when I would try to tell people, and I was going through severe OCD episodes at that point, was it was heavily minimized. And so one of the things that I've read a lot in the literature is this positive association with OCD. They say, "Oh, I bet you're so tidy, and I bet you're so organized." And I'm like, I'm convincing myself I'm going to kill people. Like, that's not what
Right.
I'm dealing with. And so I was met with so much trivialization of what I was going through of, "Oh, we're all a little OCD." And it was so demoralizing in those moments that it took me a long time to become more comfortable advocating for it because I had to get to a place of almost detaching from it emotionally. So when I explained it to people, I could go, "Hey, no, so what you're saying is actually not correct. And what you're saying is minimizing what I'm going through." Um, and so as I got more comfortable with that, I realized this is not going to change if I'm not a voice for it. And who better to be a voice for it than someone in the mental health field who has the lived experience? And so that's when I started kind of dipping my toe in talking about my diagnosis. I started with parents at my school whose children had OCD. And then as I got more comfortable, my boss, the director of psych services in Fulton, I said, "Hey, I want to do a presentation to all the psychologists on what this looked like." And that kind of started my dive into all of the literature and what it meant. And that kind of got the momentum going to be where I am today.
That is remarkable. And I think that also you're doing double the work and lovingly so. And it sounds like with a lot of passion is you're doing the work yourself with your own journey, with your own mental health. And you're also imparting all that wisdom to other families, other providers, and in the community too. We don't usually talk about that dynamic, I think, outside of these spaces of what it's like to be that therapist, that speaker, or just that professional who has that duality of I'm talking about something and I also live this as well. I do a lot of chronic illness work and I'm impacted by some chronic illness myself. And like you said, you just don't know what you don't know. And there's a lot of unlearning of what do you mean this isn't people's normal? Please don't
Mhm.
categorize me as quirky or really organized or tidy when all I see is this was normal, but now I see it as distressing. And
Yeah.
now I see that it's harmful. So for you, what's something that you wish people would really understand about what OCD actually feels like and not what the social stigmas say?
A great question. I think one of the hardest parts about OCD is that it's contramoral. And so it's ego diagnostic. It goes against what your desires are. And so if you're someone who desires to have a clean house and you're cleaning your house and you're compulsive about that, well, that's not OCD because it's bringing you joy. OCD goes against your desires, your wants, your morals in some ways. And I think that's what causes the distress. I also think that's where, when people don't have an understanding of mental health, it can feel scary to people when you're dealing with something like harm OCD, where it's, "Oh my gosh, I'm so scared I'm going to hurt my husband." And then the next question, rightfully so, is, "Well, do you want to hurt your husband?" And someone with
Right.
OCD is like, "No, my husband is my favorite person in the entire world. I am obsessed with him." And that's why my OCD has chosen these things because it finds your passion, it finds what you love, and it attacks that. And I think that is such a deep pain. And so it's never, my compulsions are never things I want to do. They're things that get in the way of me living successfully. In fact, in order for it to be OCD, we know that there has to be a level of distress. If you're enjoying what you're doing, is not OCD. And so I think that's where I wish people who didn't understand it would know that people with OCD are in distress. We are not wanting to do these things. We are not enjoying doing these things. We would desperately wish to stop doing them, and that's where it becomes a disorder.
Mhm. And I think at some point socially, I think people, I thought of it as OCD as it's just a passion gone too far, gone to the extreme. Like you said, it's the person, it's like the Danny Tanner in Full House who loves cleaning and just only cleans all the time. It's like, no, Danny Tanner loved to clean. And so that I love that kind of breaking it down in terms of your morals. I think it's a really wonderful way of explaining OCD. So, how would you define and explain what OCD is to a non-mental health professional?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, OCD is defined by two different pieces of it. It's defined by obsessions and compulsions. And so, obsessions are things that you think about constantly. Typically, this has to take up at least an hour of your day. So, once again, if you're thinking about something and it's like, this took 10 minutes, when I was having severe OCD episodes, I was replaying an event in my head, maybe over the course of 15 hours of that day, to the point where I was not functional, right? So if your brain is that taken up by thought, how are you then successful in the workforce or socially or interpersonally? Like you can't. So there's that obsession piece where you're obsessed with something, and that can be, and I don't want to trivialize that contamination OCD. It can be cleanliness, but it also can be religion, it can be morality, it can be harm, it can be sexuality, it can be pedophilia, which is that word that's scary that we say, but it's a piece of OCD. And it's just this intense fear of what if I do this thing or what if this thing happens? And then the compulsion comes in where it's this action, whether it's mental or physical, that you have to engage in order to try to mitigate that distress. And so I think one of the things that's hard is that for a while we thought those compulsions had to be physical. So, okay, I'm scared my family is going to die, so I have to touch the doorknob 3 times. Well, that's
Mhm.
very easy to see. And as a therapist, as a practitioner, you can see that and say, okay, I see that person doing that. What we've learned through kind of learning more about OCD is that those obsessions and those compulsions can be completely mental. So for me, it would be, what if I harmed this person? That's the obsession, right? The compulsion is then replaying every interaction in my head that I had with that person every single day over and over again and critiquing, was there any piece along that way where I hurt them? Was there any piece where they could have been hurt? You can't see that. So if we
Mhm.
don't have people talking about these things, we're not going to know that they're happening. And I think when you're not informed on what OCD is, this becomes your normal. You don't realize that not every person has these thoughts and has these concerns. And so I think that's where it gets tricky. So understanding it's created by these obsessions, by these compulsions. They are time consuming. The DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for Mental Illness, says that it has to take at least an hour a day, and it has to cause some sort of distress, whether that's getting in the way of you being successful in the workforce, if it's getting in the way of your mental health. Like there has to be a level of distress that comes along with it in order for it to be a disorder. And so if you're not meeting those criteria, you might be, a little neurotic, but you don't have OCD. And so I think that's where I wish the general population would understand that.
Absolutely. So then what would you say are a lot of those key differences between OCD and then things like anxiety or perfectionism?
Right. And that's really hard. And so, in fact, there was this research study done in New York. I want to say 2015. Don't quote me on that, but I am pretty sure. And they actually they interviewed doctors, and what they did was they sent out vignettes, so these little short stories of people who were presenting with mental illness, and every vignette was OCD, but in the different forms. And so they sent it out
Ooh.
to all of these doctors. And in fact, I replicated this study when I do my presentation. I replicate this pre-test, post-test,
Mhm.
where we give these vignettes of different people having different presentations of OCD. And
Mhm.
when these doctors were given these vignettes, and these are licensed medical professionals, um, were given these vignettes, and they were asked, "What diagnosis would you say this person is presenting with? What is your course of treatment?" They were only 50% successful in diagnosing OCD. The other 50% was completely out of line. And what we saw is the more stigmatized the OCD, the less likely they were to correctly diagnose. So contamination OCD was diagnosed correctly almost 80% of the time, whereas pedophilia OCD, harm OCD, sexuality OCD were like 3 or 4% of the time. they were being misdiagnosed as things like schizophrenia or
Wow.
personality disorders. And the reason why that's so concerning is not just the incorrect diagnosis, but it's the fact that then the course of treatment was incorrect. So we know OCD is highly responsive to exposure response prevention therapy, which we'll talk more about,
Mhm.
and SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Um, they were prescribing antipsychotics for these people with OCD, thinking that it was some sort of like schizoaffective. And so, what that tells us is it's really hard to figure out what is OCD and what is something else. We also see that people with OCD are often likely to have other mental health diagnoses. So,
Mhm.
really common comorbid is depression. It makes sense if you feel like your whole life is falling apart, it makes sense that you would be depressed. But we see really high suicide rates in people with OCD, really high
Mhm.
rates of suicidal ideation. We see a lot of comorbidity with anxiety disorders. That's interesting because OCD is an anxiety disorder. In
Mhm.
fact, for a while, it was categorized as an anxiety disorder in like the manual. Since then, it is now its own disorder, but
Mhm.
it's still a disorder that stems from anxiety. So it's really hard to tell the two apart. And then when you look at things like autism spectrum disorder, which is also very commonly comorbid, well, then you look at those things like rigidity and perfectionism and how do you weave them out? And I think really the only way you can is by working with a mental health professional, because you
Mhm.
have to dive into the why of why am I doing this? Am I doing this repetitive behavior because it's bringing me sensory stimulation? Or am I doing it because if I don't do it, someone's going to die? And
Mhm.
figuring those things out, really you have to tease into the weeds of it. You can't just look at it and know. And I think that's what's so tricky about it.
Absolutely. Because also there's to get to that point of really talking through that train of thought. And almost like with kids, we always talk about a train car and what car connects to the next one and the next one and what that series of events looks like. To even get to that conversation, the rapport and the trust that has to be built. Because
Yeah.
again, these thoughts are so wildly distressing.
Scary.
And like you said, contramoral, to even feel safe bridging that subject in a therapy session or in a therapeutic context just takes so much, obviously, rapport and skill and kindness and breaking that stigma. I think that's where on the provider end, that is our responsibility to say, wait a second, we need to kind of confront our own biases and our own stereotyping of what this could look like to be able to serve these clients in a much better way.
I think too, it's tricky. I'd love to kind of talk about what this looked like in early childhood for me,
Hmm.
because that was also so atypical. And the issue is as parents, we don't know what we don't know. And
Hmm.
when I eventually was diagnosed with OCD, and I came to my parents and I told them, they were carrying this guilt that I don't think was appropriate to be carrying. And not that they don't love me, and of course they felt guilty that they didn't know, but they didn't know. And
Hmm.
so for me, it was like, well, how could you have known that this was OCD? You're not mental health professionals. You didn't know what questions to ask. This was highly atypical, but you had no idea. And so I think one of my biggest things is we need to educate parents, we need to educate families and teachers and those of us who see children on a day to day basis, because we have such a limited understanding of OCD as a society. And so it's hard to catch. And so when I was a kid, if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of backtrack now.
Please.
Like what
Yes.
it looked like when I was little. So my first OCD episode happened when I was 7. Took me 18 years to get a diagnosis, which sounds wild, but the average amount of time is 13 years from the
Wow.
initial, yeah. So we're really, really bad at diagnosing OCD is what we're learning. We're bad at it, and people with OCD don't know they have OCD and don't know that they need to receive treatment. And I can say that as someone who's lived it, who has the degree in it, and still is like, I think I'm okay. And I was not, I was not okay. So when I was 7, we moved houses. And what we know is that OCD does tend to kind of blossom in times of distress because all of our facilities kind of diminish, right? So when you're stressed and when you're anxious, anything that's present just expands a little bit. So my first OCD episode was when I was 7, and we called it my I think phase. And forever, like up until I got my diagnosis, that's what we called it. It was Brittany's I think phase. It was kind of weird. And all of a sudden, out of the blue, I stopped being able to answer yes or no questions. I was
Wow.
terrified of telling a lie. I was convinced that if I somehow, for some way, was wrong and I was telling a lie, it was this earth shattering anxiety, right? So the obsession was fear of telling a lie, compulsion was could not answer yes or no questions. So my parents were like, oh my gosh, what is happening? And they were trying to figure it out. So they, bless them, my parents are such angels. They made flashcards that we took to the dinner
Oh,
table of these
wow.
outlandish scenarios. So, did you punch your teacher in the face today? Did you break your arm at school? Thinking, okay, we're gonna help her answer yes or no.
Mhm.
These are outlandish. I could not answer that. And the more they pushed, the more I was sobbing hysterically. I could not figure out how to answer these questions. Um, in the same time period, I started obsessively showering. So,
Mhm.
really, really scalding hot showers. Was convinced that my body couldn't get clean. So now we're starting to see that contamination OCD.
Mhm.
My parents were in such a state of crisis at this point that their only schema for this was, are you being sexually abused? Because
Sure.
what else could this be? Right. So they started asking me those questions. Well, couldn't answer those with the yes or no questions. Sorry, mom and dad. So imagine how stressful and scary for them. Well, they start looking into child psychologists in the area. They're trying to figure it out. And then it stopped. And they went, okay,
What
that
happened? Yeah.
was weird. And we all kind of moved on. And it's interesting because in my head as an adult, up until my diagnosis, I was like, isolated incident. And after getting my diagnosis, I realized how sneaky my OCD was and how ever present it was. So from that point, developed religious OCD, so what they call scrupulosity OCD, where I would compulsively pray at bedtime. We're Catholic, so we do the sign of the cross, right?
Mhm.
It had to be done in even numbers. If it wasn't an even number, God wasn't going to hear me. If God didn't hear me, everyone was going to die. And so I was compulsively praying for hours at bedtime and doing the sign of the cross repeatedly, trying to make sure God heard me because it was my duty to protect every person that I ever cared about and people I didn't know. So I had to pray for them too. Uh, and so that was kind of where it started. Then it transitioned from there to obsession over access to the bathroom, where I had to kind of pee on a schedule. And if I couldn't go to the bathroom on that schedule, I was in intense distress. My high school teachers would be like, hey, everything okay? And what
Mhm.
you learn when you live with OCD is you get so good at lying. And
Right.
so we don't want people to know because you're aware to some degree that this is weird. And so I'd be like, oh, I'm a cross country runner and I drink so much water. So, sorry. You figure it out. As I got older, as your morality changes and develops, your OCD changes and develops. It's tricky to catch because it's ever changing. So then I became obsessed with the fear of having a sexually transmitted disease, even though I, at this point, was not sexually active. So, how
Mhm.
does that happen? It can't. But does your
Yep.
brain care? No. But I was aware of the fact that something didn't make sense, that I was going to get STD tested as someone who wasn't sexually active. So I was lying to the nurses. I'm telling them, oh, this thing happened. I was with this guy and I was worried. Because how do you tell someone there's actually no reasonable cause, but I am convinced and I do need to
Sure.
get.
Mhm.
So it kind of pivoted and transitioned. And then when I met my husband, who is my best friend in the whole world, and he is incredible, it became really focused on harm OCD with him. So what if I break his trust and I hurt him in these horrible ways? Or what if I'm not worthy of being his wife? Or what if he needs to know every single detail of every single bad thing I've ever done in my entire life because somehow he's going to learn a single thing about me and then he's going to realize that's the last straw. And so it was compulsively confessing. It was over apologizing, where if I did one thing that I thought was wrong, I would apologize to him like 40 times. Like I could not stop apologizing. And like I said, he is an angel. He is my favorite person. And he'd be like, hey, you've apologized to me 6 times for this. And I was like, but seven is the lucky number. So let's
Mhm.
go seven. And finally, I got to the point where he sat me down and he said, hey, I love you. I don't know what's happening, but we need to go get you help. And so he said, I'm going to hold your hand. We're going to call a therapist. We don't know what this is. He's like, but I know that this is now officially outside of your control
Mhm.
and we need to figure this out. And so that was what started my journey into therapy, where I got my diagnosis. And then what was so wild is treatment works. It's incredible. And I'm living a life now that I never thought was possible. And I think that is such a testament to why I feel so compelled to educate, is that treatment truly does work. Psychoeducation works. And it doesn't mean my OCD is gone, but it means that when I feel these feelings or these fears, I no longer feel that judgment towards myself. And I can take a step back and say, oh, that's not me, that's my OCD. And we're going to let her have a second. We're going to put her over here and I'm going to breathe and move past it. And it is the most freeing thing. And it's why I feel so called to talk about it, because I know that treatment's not effective for everyone to this degree. And I do pair treatment, right, with SSRIs, which has also been game changing. But it's leaps and bounds from where I was pre-diagnosis.
And so, I mean, I think your story is so, first of all, thank you for sharing so much of your story. I mean, the amount of like vulnerability and openness, and also the self-acceptance that it takes for you to really talk about your story is, I really do think it's a testament to the work that you've done and the community that you've built. And that's never to be kind of overlooked at all. But I do think that what is that process of diagnostics and assessment like for someone? So if they're listening to this or they're hearing you and they say, oh my gosh, like maybe this is someone metaphorically holding my hand and saying, this isn't you, we need to get some help. And they have the, well, what's next? What does it look like to be assessed? What is that?
Sure. So it's a great question. Now, my journey is slightly different because I paired my ERP, which is exposure response prevention, and I'll talk about what that felt like and what that was like. But I paired that with trauma focused CBT therapy. And so we did that at the same time. I was working through a lot of trauma and a lot of shame. And my OCD was latching onto those things. And so one of the parts of my journey was healing that trauma and healing that shame, because it gave my OCD less to latch onto. And what we saw is as I processed that, my OCD got less scary because it had less scary things to latch onto. So my journey is slightly different. But for someone without that trauma piece who's just looking at what does treatment and assessment look like, it looked like meeting with a therapist and telling them, and it was scary. And I started with the not scary things, and that's okay. So I said, hey, this is what my brain is doing right now. And I have no idea why, but help.
Yeah.
And they did. And so my therapist, my first therapist, we did not do any OCD work, bless her. But Angela, we call her Angela the Angel. She truly was a life-changing person. Just sat me down and was like, okay, let's talk about it. Like what is impacting your ability to be happy right now? What is impacting your ability to live life? And we just kind of laid it out on the table. And I didn't have to start with the scariest of scaries because we built that rapport. And I don't want people going into this to think, oh my gosh, I have to lay it all on the table with a stranger. Eventually, yes, for healing, you might, but you can
Sure.
start small. So,
Mhm.
hey, every time I come to therapy, before I sit down with you, I have to go to the bathroom and I get trapped in there and I can't leave. And I stay in there for like 5, 10 minutes. That's a thing that's happening. And she was like,
Mhm.
okay, and what are you feeling in those moments? And I was like, terror. I'm
Mhm.
anxious, my body clenches up. And so we talked through what that looked like. We kind of talked through my history with it. And then she kind of, as we talked, helped me tease out, okay, I think this is what you're dealing with. I think this is OCD. At that point, she started asking me about my symptomatology. So, have you experienced this? Is this what you're feeling? What does this look like? And once we got a diagnosis, we could have a course of action. And I think, I told my husband when I got my diagnosis, I was like, oh my God, I have this diagnosis. Neither of us knew about this. How do you feel that I have this diagnosis? And he was like, babe, nothing about you changes with this diagnosis. You are going to be the exact same person whether or not we labeled it. But now that we labeled it, let's attack it. Let's work on
Yeah.
it, because you can't do that if you don't put a name on it. And I think there's so much fear around, well, I don't want to be a person with a chronic mental illness. But the reality is you are. If you were born with those cards, you were born with those cards. It's what do we do to address it? And so at that point, we started ERP therapy, also trauma focused CBT, which was incredible. And for anyone
Mhm.
who's listening who's like, I don't have OCD, but I do have trauma. Trauma focused CBT therapy. We could do a whole other thing on it. It was just absolutely incredible. But ERP therapy is exposure response prevention. And what that looks like is you expose yourself to the thing that you're scared of.
Mhm.
And then you see how long you can go without having a response to it. And the reason why is because you're retraining your brain that if this thing doesn't happen, the world is actually not going to end. If I only apologize to my husband once instead of 30 times, nothing is actually going to change in my life. And you sit in those feelings. And I think really hard to do if you don't have a community around you to support you with it. And if you don't have a community to support you, I would say you really need to partner with your therapist to be that support for you. My husband read some literature. He read Loving Someone with OCD, which is a book that exists on the impact of that on him because it goes
Mm.
against his nature. If I'm sobbing and saying, I need to apologize to you one more time, but my therapist told me to tell him, you tell her no. It's a weird dynamic. As a parent, it's a weird dynamic when your child is in distress. And you really have to have that psychoeducation to understand this feels icky, but I am healing this person. We are healing this person together. And so we started with like the least scary things. So we didn't start with, I'm scared I'm going to hurt my husband because that was at the top of my fear hierarchy. We started with,
Sure.
when you get to therapy, instead of going to the bathroom and sitting in there for 5 minutes, you're going to go in and you're going to set a timer for 60 seconds. And when that timer goes off, you are leaving. And she was like, and if you have to go back halfway through your session, that's fine. But I
Hmm.
just want you to leave the bathroom at the 60-second mark. And it was hard, but knowing that I had that support of someone who was encouraging me and there was no shame if I failed. And I think that's one of the things is your therapist does not expect you to be perfect.
No,
You
not at
are
all.
going, we all fail, but
Hmm.
that's okay because it's part of the journey and it's a step in the journey. And so as we started working on those exposures, what my brain started to realize is I don't have as much power here as I thought I did. My OCD was learning that it couldn't control my life because I was going to fight against it. And it was really hard and it was a work in progress. And I am thankful that I had people in my life who supported it. But the treatment was so impactful and so successful. And it was truly life changing.
So if I mean, I think that I actually really love your explanation of ERP because I really enjoy doing ERP with clients myself. But again, coming from someone who has been on both sides of it, I think it's just so much more impactful, just like having that voice, as opposed to someone like me who I've read about it, I've worked with it with clients, but I just don't have that other lived experience. So, if someone is kind of wanting to care for someone with OCD or support them, are there specific skills or tools to help make life seem safer or more welcoming or warmer?
That's such a good question. Shout out to your interviewing. It is amazing.
Thank you.
That's such a good question. I think what's so important is that it has to be a partnership. And that's
Mhm.
one of the things that I work through in teaching adults and parents on how to work with it is that the person with OCD cannot feel attacked in the healing. So you only need the support that you need. So I knew that I needed my husband to be a part of this journey with me because a lot of my compulsions were centered around him. But I had to get to a place where I was ready to offer that piece of the journey to him
Mhm.
because he was reading the literature. He was learning, okay, you got to set hard, firm boundaries. But if he had started doing that without having those conversations with me, without us sitting and talking about what was that going to feel like, what was that going to look like? Hey, when you tell me I can't tell you I'm sorry again, I'm going to be in distress and I'm going to be crying and I might beg you to let me say I'm sorry again.
Mhm.
One of the things that we learned was timeline setting. So if he told me you can say it once and then you can't say it ever again, there is this piece of your brain that feels panicked by that finality of it versus you can say this to me once and if at bedtime you're still feeling compelled to tell me again, you can. It let my brain know that it wasn't final, that if I was still in a state of crisis by bedtime, I could have that release. But what
Mhm.
it allowed my brain to do was kind of release that anxiety and that stress. And what I often found was by bedtime, I didn't need to tell him anymore because my body had de escalated. Whereas I think if he had set that firm boundary aggressively, it would have been harder. And then as we went, we started stretching that. Okay, so now it's not bedtime. Now, if you're still feeling distress in the morning, we can talk about it. But it had to be this collaborative effort. And I think one of the things that's hard is when we're adults in a child's life with OCD, we want to make all those decisions for them. We want to do it. But the issue with ERP is it actually doesn't work if the person isn't all in, if the child isn't all in.
Yeah.
And so you have to make them feel supported. And so you can't just tell their teachers, hey, on a whim, Sally's never allowed to wash her hands because Sally's going to feel attacked by those adults in her life. She's not going to feel supported. Whereas if the therapist and the teacher meet with the child and it's, hey, your teacher knows you're going through this. Do you think it's okay if we tell your teacher to set this boundary? Well, now
Mhm.
we're feeling loved and supported versus someone shutting down this access to us. And so I think that's such a big piece is open communication, making that person feel loved and accepted, and having the conversation before you're in crisis of what is this going to feel like for me? What is this going to feel like for you? Let's prepare for that emotionally because when it happens, we need to know how to handle it. So I think that is so important and just so much love and acceptance. And then grace. Like I needed him to give me grace because some days I was going to fail and some days I was going to beg and I was like, I need you to let me say this. And I needed the grace from him that I know that if I didn't do it one day, that he still had faith that I was trying. And I think that was such a big helper in the process.
It's an incredible partnership that you have gained, obviously with your husband, with your therapist, and all of your care partners. And I do think that again, it's holding everybody else accountable, knowing that your OCD, it was your brain's way of establishing a safety protocol. Was that safety protocol, did it match your morals, your values? No, it didn't. But I love that we can use things like ERP, like SSRIs with that support to just create better safety protocols for your life that just fits you. It's like you went from wearing clothing that never fit you, was two sizes too small at least, to now all of a sudden, this is your clothing, this is your closet now, and just finding that shift.
I love that you said safety protocol, and I think that's such a beautiful way to frame it because when you're loving someone with OCD, you can wonder like why are they doing this? Like why is this person doing this to me? Why are they doing this to our family? And understanding that the person is not doing that, kind of personifying their OCD as this is the OCD. And the person that I love has developed this because their brain is trying to feel safe and it doesn't know how to do it. And when you can look at that person and say, this is not them trying to be difficult, this is them trying to be safe. And their brain loves me so much that their brain is only worried about keeping me safe. And that is coming out as this OCD. I think it allows you to see that person as a person and not their OCD and understand why they're doing it. And so I love that you called it that because it truly was what made me feel safe. And what I was learning was this isn't comfortable. This isn't what life has to feel like, and unlearning that.
Absolutely. Brittany, thank you so much for this conversation, for your insight, for your incredible gifts with talking about OCD, working with OCD. I really just cannot thank you enough for your
Thank
time and your
you.
energy in this conversation.
Thank you for having me. This is my first ever interview. Normally, I'm up with my PowerPoint presentation and I'm prepared. So I was so nervous, and you made me feel so seen and so safe. And I just am really thankful you gave me the space to advocate as it's OCD Awareness Month.
Absolutely, always. So we will link everything about you in the comments, and we really just want to continue to have this conversation very soon.